Hi everyone, my name is Robert Gregory and I'm the CEO of the Australian Jewish Association. Also visible on the screen is AJA President Dr. David Adler. Tonight will be a little bit different. Due to the terrible situation in Israel, as David just mentioned, we're going to start with an update from the ground. And we're going to continue with this format for the foreseeable future, as long as the terrible situation in Israel continues. You can ask questions the usual way by raising your hand, but due to the reduced question time, we'll be prioritizing first-timers and people who don't usually ask questions. So I want to welcome AJA friend Yishai Fleisher. Yishai is a spokesman for the Jewish town of Hebron in Yehuda and Shomron, and he's a very well-known broadcaster and lecturer and expert in many areas. So Yishai, please give us an update on what's happening.
Hi, everybody. Thank you very much. Thank you, Robert. Thank you, David. It's good to be with AJA. I visited Australia with AJA. It was a great time, but today's different. So we're together virtually, and then maybe not such a great time, ostensibly. Although it's important to remember that Rabbi Cook, who is the first chief rabbi of Palestine, used to say that war has an element of Mashiach. It has a messianic kind of element. Things change. Things move, hopefully, in the right direction. Folks, October 7th, Shabbat morning was also Simchat Torah. We woke up looking forward to a really fun day. I had very good guests. My good friend Alex Trayman, who's the director at jns.org, and he was at my house. And I woke up and my friend said to me, you know, there are sirens. I'm like, yeah, no, not sirens, booms. There were booms. I said, yeah, I heard those booms also. Maybe it's a work thing. Who knows what that is? It just seemed like it could be anything. And then when we were standing outside from the sukkah looking out, suddenly we heard the sirens, and then we understood that something is definitely afoot. That these are rockets that are aimed at us close to Jerusalem. And when I went down to the synagogue, there's always in Israel, even though all the phones were off, not all the phones were off, and there was always people who knew what's going on. There's always people like that, and we started getting the information drips and drabs. But it became pretty obvious already by 10 a.m. It was obvious that we're talking about a major attack, a very well-organized attack. The numbers, as you have already seen, is upwards of 1,300 dead and 200 captives, very disturbingly. People who were captured and dragged into Gaza. Some have already been confirmed dead, but others have not. And this includes women and children. And there's this just horrifying videos that have come out. Now, this word horrifying is important because we have seen also the sadistic nature of the murder rampage. It wasn't just killing civilians; it was also torturing them, mutilating, cutting off heads, all kinds of stuff, burning of babies. Really, the worst stuff that's imagined. And responders that have been down there, friends of mine, have told me, whatever you think is bad, this is worse than we ever saw before. It's really something of a different nature of attacks. So that's true on the one hand, but there's another hand, which is I tell people to remind them, which is the truth is, though this has been a sadistic attack, the real truth is, in the 600s, Muhammad captured and killed 2 Jewish tribes, and then took the females as sex slaves. In 1929, there was a horrific riot here in the city that I'm sitting in right now, of Hebron, where 67 Jews were murdered, also dismembered, etc., purposefully. So too in 1948, the Lamed Hey. Why am I telling you all this? Because this is actually a systematic and goal-oriented action. It's not just bloodlust and sadism. It is the purpose of it is to sow fear. On the other hand, so it's a tactic, and we should know that when we call them animals and all that kind of stuff, it doesn't necessarily hurt their feelings, because they actually want to be perceived partially as sadistic and willing to do anything. One must admit that the attack was not a random attack of just guys coming in with guns and shooting what they see. We have been finding, the intel is that the bodies of the terrorists that we have recovered stuff from included very detailed maps, including things like which house has a gun, which doesn't, who has old people, who has young people, etc. It turns out, seemingly, that's what's coming out, is that the Arabs that worked on the kibbutzim that were neighboring the Gaza border gave intel, detailed intel, to the Hamas terrorists. And videos have come out also from Hamas itself, explaining that this has been a planned attack for 2 years. And of course, they tried to keep it very secretive and somehow to avoid Israeli intelligence, which is in itself a question. How did such an intelligence failure happen? And seemingly it's not a coincidence that it was 50 years to the day after the beginning of the Yom Kippur War, which also was an intelligence failure. And so we see a very highly motivated and organized attack that included these paragliders and other fast-moving attacks into Israel with a lot of intelligence on who they're attacking. There was also a nature party. That nature party had a lot of people killed, maybe 250, maybe 300, and also people dragged away. Also there's reports that the Arabs who were guarding the event, and you can ask the question, why would Arabs be guarding the event? But they also gave intel to the Hamas folks. The horrific nature of this attack has mobilized Israel, and we have right now a standing army of reserves, which is about 340,000, different numbers. Israel's mobilized on the border. Everybody knows somebody on the border. I know a lot of people, including my brother, who are on the border, ready for some kind of ground attack, some kind of ground invasion. But at the same time, we have to remember that we're dealing with an Iranian enemy, and Iranians are Persians, and Persians are world-renowned for their cleverness and their the kind of thought-out fashion in which they do things like this. And so, it could very well be that the minute Israel enters the Gaza front, the Gaza theater, another theater, which is the Lebanese Hezbollah theater, might open up. And in truth, Israel actually faces many fronts. Oftentimes when I speak in places like America, especially to liberal audiences, I'm told, well, Israel is the strong player in the region. And I always said to people, you're taking it very blithely, very nonchalantly. The truth is we have a 6-front war. Yes, 6 fronts. They are Gaza and Lebanon. They are Judea and Samaria, i.e. places under the PA control. And then we have the Israeli Arabs in the Arab cities and the mixed Arab cities like Yafo, Akko, Lud, which we saw in May 2021 erupt into riots and sprees that ended up burning 10 synagogues inside of Israel. So that's 4 fronts. You have so far Gaza, Lebanon, Judea and Samaria, regular Israel. Then you have Iran, who is racing towards a nuclear device itself. And then you have another front, which may not be a battlefront, but it's a type of battlefront that is international opinion, international say in this event. If you watch Hamas talking, they say that Iran is their ally, that Iran funded this, and they say that Russia is applauding this, and they say that they're getting support from all over the world, and they need 2 kinds of support, they say, which is arms and money. Israel is arraigned right now to strike back, but the strike has to be smart. And there's a certain frustration on the ground at the slowness of the response. On the other hand, some people say, well, Israel definitely needs to be well prepared into such a ground incursion. The place is booby-trapped, etc. And there's a lot of, because we're dealing with Persians, there's a lot of trick plays that could happen. False flags. You could start there and the explosion starts in another place. And that's the tactical situation that Israel has found itself in, is that Gaza is one front. They continue to shoot they have shot thousands of rockets, continue to shoot every day. But we know about the 200,000 accurate rockets in the hands of Hezbollah, which is a very serious fighting force. So Israel has minimally two fronts that are very active. But last night in this town where I am right now, Hebron, there was a riot. It did not reach the Jewish community, but there's a heating up that could potentially happen. Moreover, my friends caught some Arabs trying to sneak onto their farms. They took their phones, and on their phones, it's all Hamas propaganda. Hamas propaganda has infiltrated the average Palestinian and maybe even the average Israeli Arab. So that's what we're seeing. There's also global tensions that we're seeing these, pro-Israel rallies, but we're also seeing pro-Palestine rallies, the kind that also AJA was able to show the world that happened in Sydney, and so next to the Opera House. So we have also, let's call that, if you wish, we could call that a seventh front, which is a danger to Jews and pro-Israel people around the world. Example, a friend of mine told me that a friend of his who lives in France but came here to fight got a phone call from neighboring Arabs in Paris telling him, when you come home, you're a dead man because we saw that you were fighting for the IDF. The point is that Israel has found, and the Jewish people find themselves in a situation. What's going to be next? The Biden administration has shown up in Israel. Literally, Biden himself is in Israel right now. He says that he's in lockstep with Israel. On the one hand, you could take him at face value, and he's bringing his aircraft carriers here. On the other hand, it is also clear that Joe Biden, as part of the Obama administration, and later on, basically 10 years of appeasement of Iran, including the very recent payment of $6 billion to their coffers, all this while they speak of the destruction of Israel. So who is Joe Biden? It's a question mark. It's a very heated discussion. American Jewish liberals are very proud of Joe Biden's stance with Israel. More conservative people are doubtful as to his sincerity. I'll leave it at that. Let's see what else.
Yishai, can I ask you to comment on what would you like to see from Jewish diaspora, from people like us? What's the best thing we can do to help?
Right. So that's another interesting front that has opened up, which is the Jewish diaspora's support of Israel has been amazing. It's been mostly in stuff. There's been a lot of requests for stuff from everywhere, from sweaters and shampoos to arms purchases. That has happened also. There has been a lack of arms in the Israeli coffers as well, weirdly. But they're opening up right now. Look, the diaspora sends its support, both financially and with stuff, and also with pressure on their governments to not pressure Israel to stop this campaign. That's a very important thing. I think that it's very important for people to have the right verbiage. I think when you say things like flatten Gaza, it may not be necessarily helpful. I think it's important to call out who the real enemy here is, which is Iran. And therefore, the sanctions regime and other things have to be put back in place. And we have to call for regime change in that evil country, in that evil dictatorship of that ancient country. So we have to, first thing, we have to hit the master, not the stick. The stick is Gaza and Hamas, but the master is Iran in this case. The other thing is we have to, in my opinion, call out the real goals of this conflict. I have a very simple goal. It's a two-pronged goal, which is we have to make sure that at the end of this conflict, there's going to be 0 schools teaching jihadism in and around the land of Israel. 0 radio stations and TV stations blaring out jihadism in and around our land. 0 mosques teaching jihadism because they inflame the public. We've got to call for that. That's the big picture. Hamas is a wing of the jihad, a powerful one, a well-organized one, but not the only jihad out there. The other thing, maybe more contentious, is I would call for the voiding of the Oslo Accords. The Oslo Accords have been shown to be something that allows PA and then Hamas to take over large swaths and turn them jihadist against us. I am right now sitting in the midst of an Arab city, Hebron, and it's got a small Jewish enclave inside of it. And that Arab city is mostly ruled by Hamas. So therefore, I say that we have got to see the big picture. We've got to call for the end of the allowance of jihadism. By the way, there's a video that I posted on my Twitter of UNRWA school children, Arab school children in Judea-Samaria, in the so-called West Bank, explaining what they believe in these UNRWA schools. And it is jihadism, black on white, the call to destruction of Israel, that Jews are devils, et cetera, et cetera. This is UN funding. So I would certainly call for the defunding of the UN, as was being done under the Trump administration. I would call out the jihad now in all of its various faces. And for Australia, for example, I would call to stop the people that are calling for jihad. Arrest them. Look in their stuff. They probably have weapons. They're probably aiming to attack Australia or Australian Jewish institutions as well. This is what these people are calling for. And so I'll, how much more time do I have, David? I can't hear you. I don't hear you. How much more time?
Our other guest hasn't arrived yet, so you got a minute or two.
Oh, good. So yeah. I'll make my my short and clear pitch. You know, when cataclysms befall the Jewish people, biblically speaking, we return to God. We do something called tshuva. We repent. And I believe that the repentance that's called for today is twofold. One is more unity amongst the Jewish people. That's a type of repentance. And the Hamas folks that have been interrogated have all said that Israel's disunity gave them heart. This was a time to attack. Just like in the Bible, Amalek attacks when the Jews are fighting amongst each other. So that's one. Repentance, return to God, take upon yourself something Jewish, say a psalm, keep a Sabbath, love a fellow Jew, you know, and broadcast strength. But that's one kind of tshuva. The other kind, maybe harder, is the tshuva of common sense. We've got to return to common sense policies. You cannot allow Hezbollah to have 200,000 rockets prepared and trained at your head. When you allow that and you don't strike decisively first, they get the message that Israel's weak and is just defensive and is waiting to be attacked. You cannot allow jihadism to flourish in your land, in areas A and B, or in so-called Eastern Jerusalem. You can't allow that. To be a real Middle Easterner is to understand that a warring tribe wants to erase you and take over your land. And therefore, we have to be real. And so therefore, I'm calling for the tshuva, the repentance of common sense. Got to be a common sense approach. We cannot allow this kind of stuff to flourish in our land. Hamas, other organizations, and broadly speaking, Palestinian society and Arab Israeli society are part of this matrix. And you may not want to accept that. It may seem a little far-flung to you because you may be living in Brooklyn or in Australia. And it doesn't seem that people like that. But here in the Middle East, it's clear. And now it has become clear to people who did not see it clearly. And therefore, it's time to end the appeasement policies. If Mahmoud Abbas gets up at the UN and makes a vile anti-Semitic speech, that guy should not be in charge of anything. He should be in the ground, or he should be not here. He should not be a player. He certainly shouldn't be getting American money and Israeli money. It's time to get back. You see jihadism on your university campus, kick them out. Don't let them be there. They will sway people to murder Jews. So if you want to be a Jewish state, you got to come back to a reasonable, common sense policy that hits hard against folks that want to kill you. That's just the way it is. And so those are the two kinds of tshuvas. And again, also the kind of Jewish unity, as I think we're doing right now, David, by the very fact that we're speaking together. This is also an element of Jewish unity. We're sticking together in this time. We've got to find ways to bridge the gaps, including the gaps of the big oceans and divides, and also the spiritual and sociological divides that divide between us. B'ezrat Hashem, Am Yisrael Chai. I would say Am Yisrael still Chai and fighting, and we will get to this. This is going to be a conflict. I don't know if it's going to end soon and then simmer, or it's going to actually expand. Whatever it is, Am Yisrael Chai, we have to be strong right now, and we have to look to an eye towards victory and towards rebuilding our land and strength again. Thank you, David.
Look, Yishai, thank you so much. You're a great friend of AJA, and I just want to say in closing, congratulations on receiving the some sort of Ari Fuld award.
Yes, the Ari Fuld Lion of Zion Award. It's the second year that they've given it. My colleagues and friends, Ari and Jeremy, were the first recipients, and this year they gave it to me in a surprise. I didn't know that I was getting it. And truth is, it was one of the greatest honors of my life because Ari Fuld was a Jewish hero, and I think I stand for things similar to what he stood for, which is Jewish defense, which is the love of the land of Israel, the love of the Torah, and the love of Jewish unity. And it was a great privilege to receive that. And I said about him, his family was in attendance, and I said about him that his life, his personage was like, when he died, it was like splitting the atom. The atom was split, and the energy went out to the world, and that's what Ari Fuld's great energy is like, and I'm proud to be part of it.
Well, we share the great honour of having hosted not just Yishai Fleisher, but also Ari Fuld. I can see that our other esteemed guest has arrived. Amanda Stoker, would you like to say hello to the AJA group? We have about over 140 people online at the moment, plus Facebook and others.
Hello, everyone. I'm enormously honoured to be with you tonight. Thank you, David. I really appreciate the opportunity to be with you. I also want to extend my enormous sympathy, my incredible sorrow, and indeed my anger at what is going on in Israel at present. I have only been to Israel once. I fell in love with it immediately, and anyone who has any appreciation of the history of the region could not possibly, in good conscience, stand under some pretense of Palestinian support for the conduct of Hamas during this period. And I mean, Hezbollah could be accused of many of the same things over time. So I really do want you to know that I stand with you entirely. I am disgusted and appalled and in great fear, really, for the people of Israel as they go through these really difficult times. But it is wonderful to see there are so many good people in Australia prepared to stand by your side, as you no doubt have anxiety for people that you care about in that part of the world. So my prayers are with you.
Mandy, the person who gave us the Israel briefing is Yishai Fleisher. He's the official Jewish representative of the city of Hebron, which has one of the greatest depths of history in the world. It's where Abraham, Isaac, Jacob's tombs are. And next time you go to Israel, I'm sure we'll twist Yishai's arm to show you around that particular section. Yishai, you're welcome to stay or go as you choose.
I want to thank you. I have to keep going, get out there and fight a little bit. Amanda, God bless you, and thank you so much for all that you do. Thank you, David. Thank you, Robert. God bless all of you guys, Australia and the AJA. Thank you for being such good friends of Israel. Thank you.
Thank you, Yishai, and I'll take you up on that.
You got it.
Keep up the good fight.
Thank you very much.
Robert, do you want to introduce the actual program part now?
Yeah, thank you so much, Amanda, for those very kind words. And obviously, all our thoughts are with Israel. So it's very important we had that briefing. So thank you, Yishai. Thank you, Amanda. The next major political issue in Australia, at least as we see it, is the so-called misinformation, disinformation legislation. Amanda Stoker, our guest, is a former senator, assistant minister, Sky News host, a columnist, and she was recently pre-selected as the LNP candidate for a seat in the Queensland Parliament. Many are calling her one of Australia's best conservative minds, so it's a real pleasure to have you here. And let's hear about this legislation.
Robert, thank you so much for the warm.
We've got two topics to touch on as we foreshadowed. Amanda, fortunately, and I will say fortunately, because we were on the no side of the referendum, we saw every state and territory, bar Canberra, which has a message in itself, I think,
I agree.
vote reasonably decisively no. What's your take on the outcome of the referendum? What are the implications for Australian politics?
I think there's two really important lessons to take from last weekend's result. The first is to say that it is really the only opportunity Australians have had so far to unambiguously send a signal that they don't like the product of identity politics in our society. They don't like the idea that we should all be treated not as human beings of equal value and equal dignity as created in the image of God, but instead as defined, limited, and circumscribed by genetic attributes over which we have no control. That is really, really significant because identity politics is often a term that's used among those who are particularly engaged in politics, but for the mum or dad or older person who's just trying to get by, those can sound like esoteric concepts that don't really apply to their everyday lives. The voice proposal in our constitution was the first opportunity to clearly send a signal on a proposal that was a direct product of that ideology.
Mm-hmm.
And it was an emphatic no, even from the fact that states which were thought by many to be a fait accompli for the yes side, such as Victoria, nevertheless rejected concept. So
Amazing.
it really is extraordinary, but I think that should be deeply encouraging for people like us who see enormous dignity and value in human life, and that we see that in a way that transcends race or colour or any of the other ways that the Marxists might try to sort us in order for classification and either progress or the contrary. That I think is hugely significant. The other lesson I think to take from last weekend is that there are no fait accomplis in politics. And by that I mean, about a year ago, the coalition were told in no uncertain terms by the people who they normally depend upon for information about the mood of the community, that there was no way on earth a voice in the Constitution could be defeated.
Wow.
And they were told that by everybody in the business, that it could not be done. And yet, simply by standing on principle, having the hard argument in an intellectual and sensible way, an approximately 70% support level for that constitutional change was converted into something a lot closer to the very opposite.
Correct.
That I think is significant because it should tell those people who treat politics, particularly in the coalition side, and I don't want to be overly critical, it's just what I know best, right? It should tell people on the coalition side of politics that you do not have to pitch to those on the left in order to succeed. Indeed, if you try, you will fail because there are more authentic products in the market for ideas who will more sincerely pitch for those extreme opinions of the left. Instead,
sorry.
I'll just finish this sentence. I beg your pardon. Instead, the way forward, both in terms of doing the right thing and in terms of political success, is to argue the difficult things from our values, from first principles, and that the electorate are smart enough and capable enough to reward those that will courageously do so. I'll leave it at that.
There's actually an Israeli saying that if you've got experts that tell you something can't be done, get other experts. You've got,
it's a fair point, right?
Yeah. Now, you're about to make the transition to state politics. So I want you to comment, please, on what seems to be 3 state premiers, the 3 East Coast state premiers, who are going to do their own version of the voice. Oh, can add South Australia. So what are we doing now? Ignoring the will of the people? We're no longer a democracy. What are these state premiers doing? Proceeding with just a cut-down version of the voice in their own jurisdictions? Do they have a mandate?
I don't think they have a mandate to do so. I think any state government worth its salt should be taking a very hard look at any proposals or even fairly advanced programs they had to go down that path and reevaluating those in light of what is a clear message from the public that this is not what they want. There's plenty of examples from Queensland, which is my home state, to show how ugly and divisive and unhelpful these kinds of concepts are when they become the rubber that hits the road. We have a beach up near Hervey Bay, for instance, over which the title has been provided to the traditional owners. No problem with them having access to it. but they've now decided to close it. And so only Aboriginal people can use a beautiful beach that in any other part of the country we would not regard as something that you could fence off and exclude people from.
Is that apartheid?
Not in the strict sense, but it's got overtones thereof.
Yeah.
And
I've seen pictures of the, this beach is for blacks, this beach is for whites from South Africa.
Yeah. And nothing good comes from this. We have plenty of examples from history of what happens when you provide for different rights for different people in a country based only on their race. And it never ends well.
Okay.
And yet there seems to be a determined effort from state governments to go down this path. There are other examples I could give you that really illustrate the same thing. But the point of it is to say that state governments that don't listen to the message that was sent last weekend ignore it at their peril, and to treat the result as, for instance, in Queensland, the Premier did by saying, I've heard you, it's that you weren't ready for the voice. You are not yet ready for the voice, as if to say, if we just lecture you and call you a racist, either directly or subtly, for the next couple of years, then when we come back to it, you will say yes. You just weren't ready yet. To do that is to condescend enormously to the intellect of Australians and to their common sense. They don't need a few more years of indoctrination and subtle shame. What the country needs is a return to the fundamental principles that helped it to grow, helped it to become one of the freest and fairest lands of opportunity in the world, and to do that unashamedly.
Okay. I'd like to pivot on to our main subject now, Amanda, which is the, I'll call it for short, the Misinformation, Disinformation Bill. Sure. I'll let everyone know that I think it was Monday, we were in Melbourne, Robert and I, we had a meeting with the IPA in their office in Collins Street. They agree with our assessment. It's about to become the next big political issue for Australia. You're a former barrister and public prosecutor, and for those that are not familiar, can you tell us, just in summary, what this legislation is about, what the scope of it, what your view of it is?
Sure, no problem. Look, it's called the Communications Legislation Amendment, open bracket, Combating Misinformation and Disinformation, close bracket, bill. It's not very catchy, so that's why we call it the Misinformation Bill. And what it purports to do is to put into the hands of ACMA, the Australian Communications and Media Authority, the power to demand that online media providers like social media deal with what they call misinformation and disinformation in a way that restricts the flow of information that could be put into those categories. And if they fail to do so, they will face penalties that are enormous, bigger sums than most of us can conceive of. And that, I'm sure we'll talk some more about its consequences, but that represents something unprecedented in Australia. And it really draws out the tension between this desire to deal with the unregulated and sometimes dangerous aspects of the internet as they manifest in misinformation, disinformation, and puts it in a direct battle with the freedom of communication that is at the core of a healthy society, of a free democracy, and in building and maintaining the capacity of a people to be able to debate problems, find solutions, and ultimately maintain that problem-solving capacity for ages to come.
Yep. Our organisation has always argued that free speech, to quite a broad extent, is a Jewish value, that Jewish academic development occurred because our sages would argue with each other on all sorts of subjects, many of which you'd struggle to discuss in Australia today. Not advocating violence, of course, not advocating harm to people or property, but, you know, express a view, have a debate. And in order to have a debate, almost by definition, one case is going to be wrong. So do you see it? One important factor you didn't mention, and I'd like to, governments are exempt under the proposed legislation.
Yeah, there's
I'm going to show you
something very cheeky about that, isn't there?
Yeah, very. I'm going to show you an example in which I was involved personally, and ask you whether you think that had the legislation been in place at the time, an initiative that I personally was involved in would have fallen foul of the legislation. And it concerns the early part of the COVID pandemic. And you might recall that the government decided it was a good idea to promote and everyone to have a COVID-safe app. Now, some character wrote an article for the Spectator magazine. Let's get this straight. COVID safe is grossly flawed. So I'm writing something contrary to what the government is saying is an important health initiative. There are harm provisions in the proposed legislation. So it could have been argued at the time that by putting out that information, not only was it false, contrary to what the government said, contrary to Scott Morrison saying the COVID Safe app would protect you like sunscreen in the sun, but by discouraging people to use the app by saying it was flawed, I'm doing harm. Would I have fallen foul of the legislation had it been enacted?
Yeah, probably. And it's a pretty scary thought, isn't it?
Yeah.
The fact of that highlights a number of the problems with the bill. And I hope you don't mind me using that good example to segue into those real problems. What it would do is ultimately allow for governments to be the final arbiter of what is true and what is not. Now, that is one of the hallmarks of the most appalling dictatorships that have been known to history and even the present. It is not a good thing for governments to determine what is and isn't true as final arbiter. It is fundamentally a threat to our democracy to allow that to be in place. It's worth mentioning, your audience may well be cluey enough to know the difference, but many people in our community don't even know what the difference is between misinformation and disinformation. To be misinformed is to say or do something that is determined by whoever this ministry of truth might be to be incorrect, regardless of your intent. A mistaken, for instance, error. To disinformation is an active and deliberate program of disseminating false information with a view to generating or influencing some aspect of Australia's polity or society. So they're different, and intention and the knowledge of falseness is, or falsity, is at the heart of the difference. The difficulty with that, though, comes back to what David's example highlights perfectly, and that is what we know to be true is often a matter that is still emerging. It's something that's still a matter of contest. And if we take away the ability of people to have the kinds of debates where iron sharpens iron, you may never reach the point where the thing that is actually true is arrived upon. And that is both tyrannical, but also apt to kneecap a society's ability to solve its own problems. I might pause there, David, so that we can have a conversational aspect.
I think we'll move to questions, but we do a 1 minute quick promo, which I'll do now, and then I'll hand to Robert for questions. Okay. Firstly, as we always do, if there's anyone who is not yet actively supporting AJA at the end of the event, please go to the website jewishassociation.org.au, where you can become a supporter, join the email list, make a donation, please. We certainly need resources at this time. Make sure you like and follow the Facebook page, Twitter, other social media to keep up to with all the events. And let me tell you, our social media has exploded in the last 10 days. And we're now measuring our reach in many millions. It's been quite extraordinary. Next event, next week, we have, in the pattern of the double header, the Israel War Security Update will be by Barry Shaw of the Israel Institute of Strategic Studies. And we've got the CEO of Ayn Rand Institute, Tal Tzfafi, on the moral and Jewish case for liberty. Interesting to have an ex-Israeli take that position. And I just want to add that tomorrow evening I've been invited to speak at a large Christian organisation on the subject of Israel under attack. If you want to attend that, and you're encouraged to, it's at 7 p.m. tomorrow. You just need to Google this term at Eventbrite, or go to Eventbrite and search that title. It's free, but you do need to register. So open for questions. Robert, if you'd like to call
as
in.
Those questions sort of come on in, can I just touch on a couple of other little things first, if I may? The summary of the problems with the bill, I think, is this. First, it is a very dangerous thing to let governments be the arbiter of truth or falsehood. And I don't think I need to labour that point further. You're all very capable people and you know your history well enough to know how badly that can end. The second is to say there's some really broad and vague definitions in the bill that are also apt to be dangerous. And one, for example, is the concept of harm, because the rationale that's used for limiting speech in the way that this bill does is that misinformation and disinformation can cause serious harm in the community. But as we have seen in aspects of discrimination law, for instance, harm can mean very different things in different company. For instance, at the time when the law of tort was established, harm needed to be something that was really tangible, really quantifiable. In the physical sense, it had to be able to be felt or seen in a physical sense. Whereas if we look at the way the jurisprudence has emerged, what tends to be classified as harm these days is something as occasionally light as the mental confrontation associated with having to deal with an idea that you don't like. That is such a low bar for harm. It is likely to be where courts land in the absence of a clear and precise and high bar being set in the legislation. And so that is enormously dangerous. The next thing to say is that to the extent that the bill identifies what kinds of harm the bill is trying to stop, they include some really broad and almost bizarre things. One category that's relevant to David's example is that it would include harm to the health of Australians. It's a direct quote from the bill. There is no doubt that at a particular point in time, the article that David just showed would have been construed by most judges, not just the activist ones, as presenting a real danger to the health of Australians, as the evidence at that point in time was understood, at least in the mainstream. Now, we've seen over the time since that there are really legitimate differences of opinion around the intensity of the threat posed by COVID-19. And what precisely the lowest risk response would be. And so the application of a definition like that is enormously dangerous. Similarly, there's a category that says harm to the Australian environment. It would not be a long bow to draw to say that somebody who expressed a climate alarmist point of view could find themselves falling afoul in their commentary if the zeitgeist, as understood by government, as enforced upon the social media companies, was to be applied in a way that was in favour of catastrophic interpretations of climate change. The point is to say reasonable people can have very different views in these categories, and that while, particularly as people of faith, we do have a very firm understanding of what we believe to be enduring and true, there are plenty of aspects of the way that is applied in the everyday where truth is still emerging, because we're still gathering the evidence, we're still testing it, we're still researching. And to confine the ability to do that would undermine our society's ability to solve its own problems. The next thing I'd like to observe is that you don't have to show that the harm was actually caused by you in the thing that was said in order for it to qualify as mis or disinformation. It's enough that in some small sense you contribute to this serious harm occurring in our community. Again, a lowering of the bar that is entirely inappropriate, quite radical, and really at odds with fundamental principles of freedom of speech. The next is to say the exclusion of government is deeply problematic. And it speaks to a government that's prepared to say, do as I say, not as I do, or as I am prepared to do in future. That itself is something almost on its own that should warrant it not being supported. And the very fact that any government content can never be misinformation, but yet content that is critical of government, produced by somebody who is a political opponent of government, can be, is an unbalanced approach to democracy that we should reject entirely. We can ask real questions about whether the bureaucracy is skilled or capable enough to carry this weight, or indeed whether it is representative enough of the common sense views of our community. I mean, if you just look at the fact that the ACT's result in the referendum was such an outlier compared to the rest of the country, it is not a stretch to say that the Canberra swamp is not necessarily representative of the wider community. And yet this would purport to put extraordinary powers of censorship into the hands of those at the peak of the swamp. Do swamps have peaks? You get what I mean. Maybe at the depths of the swamp.
Depth, yeah,
We'll go
the
with
depth
that.
is a good one.
And so none of this is to say that misinformation and disinformation isn't a real problem. It is. The question should, though, be, how can we do that in a way that better balances the other fundamentals of a free and healthy society? This bill is not a balanced and proportionate response. Putting it as a slight aside, I have enormous problems with the fact that this government refuses to act to, for instance, require age verification for those who want to access pornography on the internet. They say they won't do that because it is technically not feasible, and yet they are prepared to inflict much wider and much more controversial censorship to, the Australian internet market, for want of a better term. And we should be very concerned that we have a government that will not act in what we know is in the interest of children and in the protection of children from concepts for which they are not ready, and that we know is causing a assaults in our community that we know is causing dysfunctional relationships when children come to adulthood, and yet they are prepared to do this. There is a deep contradiction there that we should not accept. And finally, I am not somebody who generally has an enormous number of great things to say about the Australian Human Rights Commission. My general approach is that they are really quite typically disconnected from the values of Australians, generally pretty unwilling to fight for fundamental freedoms, and generally much more interested in imposing identity politics on Australians. Fundamental freedoms be damned. Nevertheless, despite what I would say is the appalling reputation of the Australian Human Rights Commission, they have nevertheless indicated they are uncomfortable with this bill, as has a number of other organisations in our community. The inquiry drew out a huge number of responses. But for a generally hostile group of public sector swamp advocates to say this bill is a problem is such a red flag that it could not be accepted as an appropriate way to manage this problem in our society today. I'll leave it there. Let's go to questions.
Thanks so much, Amanda. Yeah, I think everyone's very concerned about the bill. You've expressed it really well. So let's first go to Alan. Would you like to unmute and ask your question?
Thanks, Robert, and hi, Amanda.
Hi, Alan.
You with the referendum, and you touched on it with the ACT. We saw that it was the inner city suburbs that were really the dominant yes voters, and they called them the elites. I'm just wondering, what is that saying about our electorate in general, and how do we stop this group dominating the conversation so much?
Great question. I think there's a few things that we can observe and a few things that we can do. It is very interesting to observe that the wealthier, the better educated, and the higher living standard of a voter, the more likely they were to be in favour of the voice. I think that speaks to the way that identity politics has become so entrenched that people who have accomplished great things and who have now got the resources to show for it no longer see the appropriate way to give back to their community as through philanthropy or as through using their God-given gifts to their highest and best capacity, because that serves society in its purest form. Instead, they see their purpose as to sort of self-flagellate and atone for their success. Now, I accept that the lottery of life isn't always fair and that sometimes some of us start out with a few more advantages than others. But it is also true to say that there is no country in the world like Australia where a person can come from whatever walk of life, and if they apply themselves, do their best and stay out of trouble, they will emerge from the course of life having had the opportunity to make themselves financially comfortable, to make themselves socially and financially secure, and have had the freedom to pursue their gifts and interests in the course of that life. That is a beautiful and wonderful thing about Australia that we should never lose. And yet the underlying message of what those in our educated and wealthy suburbs were doing, as demonstrated by their vote, suggests they no longer believe that is the way that a healthy society should order itself. I think that's culturally very significant. There is an opportunity in it though, and I think that is to say that those in our suburban belt and those in our remote places are hungry for people to speak common sense from the values that we share, and that those who can do so will unite this country around the kinds of ideals that helped to create the environment where this could be such an incredible land of opportunity. There will be an adjustment process from those who are regarded as the sort of quote unquote elites, but there is enormous opportunity for a party that is prepared to really listen and argue with courage to accept and act upon the expression of that frustration in the community.
Right, I think we just got time for one more question. Apologies to all our other questioners, but Michael.
I'm sorry, I went on too long. I beg your pardon.
No, it's all good. Mike, would you like to ask your question?
Sorry, Michael, need to unmute again. Thank you.
Yeah, hi, Amanda. Look, slightly off topic. The Greens are becoming a problem for the Jewish community. We know they're a problem now. They've now sort of outwardly come out in support of Hamas. They won't even condemn individually the terrorist attack recently in Israel. What do you think? What's behind the Greens? Is it the Muslim community vote that they're after, or is it just they're out and out anti-Semitic, the Greens?
I think, as much as I hate to say it, it is a lot less about pursuing an Islamic vote than it is about a deep-seated anti-Semitism, because it permeates so many of the causes that they are prepared to support, and so many of the policies and principles that would respect the right of Jewish people to be able to interact in our community in complete freedom and appreciation. The upside of their quite disgusting behaviour, particularly in this parliamentary week, is that this is the first proper wake-up call, I think, members of many of Australia's well-off corners has had to say, this is not some benign group of tree huggers. These are hardcore Marxist, socialists, or even communists, and that there is a deep thread of ugliness that goes far beyond patting a koala or planting a tree. The opportunity to expose the revolting ideas that lie beneath many of the Greens' policies is something we shouldn't waste. And not just for some short-term political advantage, but because the principles for which they stand, as illustrated by their stance on Israel, are deeply damaging to Australian society as much as they are deeply damaging to our relations in the world.
We've been very harsh in calling out the Greens, and I think there's a big opening to even go after Labor, that if they don't put the Greens last, if they preference the Greens over other parties, like, for example, the Coalition, then, yeah, they're essentially agreeing with anti-Semitism, and I think it's a huge weakness for them there. Yeah, that's all we have time for. I've put the link for David's next address to the Christian group in the chat, but I want to really thank you, Amanda. That was an excellent talk. First of all, thank you for your support for Israel and the Jewish people, but thank you for explaining about this bill. I think after today, everyone understands what a threat it is, what we're facing. AJA is going to oppose it. We're going to be active in this struggle. So thank you so much. Do you want to add some words, Deb?
Thank you very much for the honour of your invitation. Thank you for your passionate advocacy for the Jewish people, not only in Australia, but around the world, particularly those that are facing very difficult circumstances. I wish I was in a position to do more, but I am nevertheless extremely grateful for your company, particularly as many of you are anxious about other things.
Thank you, and hopefully you'll be elected to the Queensland Parliament. We'll have a good friend there, so thank you so much.
Absolutely. And the Jewish Council of Deputies up here are top shelf people.
Very good, very good.
Small but lovely.
There you go, some good people up in Queensland. Thank you so much, Amanda. Thank you everyone for joining us. Look forward to seeing you all next week with the double topic again, and praying for peace in Israel and for the Jewish people in the world. It's very tough times. So thank you again, everyone. Have a good night.
Thank you, Robert.
Good night.